It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, neatly trimmed lawns, kids riding their bikes, and friendly nods from the neighbors. That's what James Rourke, a US Marshal, had in mind when he moved into Maplewood Estates. After years of high-stakes operations and life-or-death decisions, he was looking forward to something simple, a place where he could come home, take a deep breath, and not have to look over his shoulder. But things weren't as perfect as they seemed. It started small. A warning notice on his mailbox. Trash bins must be removed within 1 hour of collection. It seemed excessive, but he let it slide. Then came another. Grass exceeds the allowed height limit of 3 inches. James ran his hand over the blades. It didn't even look unkempt. At first, he thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the HOA was just extra diligent about keeping the neighborhood pristine. But then, he started hearing whispers from other residents. Neighbors who refused to make eye contact, muttering about the HOA president, Karen Reynolds. James didn't pay much attention until he met her himself. She approached him one evening, just as he was pulling into his driveway. Blonde bob, sharp gaze, clipboard in hand. "Mr. James," she greeted, voice dripping with the kind of fake sweetness that set off alarms in his head. "I noticed you've been having some trouble following our community guidelines." James remained polite. "I'm doing my best to keep up." Karen's smile never wavered, but her tone hardened. "We have rules for a reason. We like to keep things orderly. I hope you understand." Something about the way she said it, like a warning disguised as a friendly reminder, made his instincts tingle. He had dealt with criminals, liars, and manipulators his entire career. And right now, he was getting the same feeling. But it was just an HOA, right? James had no idea that this was only the beginning, and that Karen was about to turn his life into a living nightmare. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Alright, let's keep going. At first, James Rourke tried to brush it off. Petty HOA rules were annoying, but not worth a fight. He paid the small fines, adjusted his trash bin schedule, even trimmed his lawn an extra inch shorter just to avoid trouble. But it didn't stop. Every week, there was something new. A $50 fine for parking too close to the curb, even though his tires weren't touching it. A $75 violation for leaving his porch light on past 10 p.m., a rule that wasn't in the HOA guidelines. Then came the most ridiculous one yet, a $100 penalty for excessive tire marks on his own driveway. James was done playing nice. One evening, as he was getting home from work, he spotted Karen Reynolds waiting, clipboard in hand, arms folded, that same tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. James," she called out as he stepped out of his car. "We need to talk." James sighed, locking his door. "What now?" Karen held up a piece of paper, another violation notice. "You've been reported for violating parking restrictions again," she said, tilting her head like a disappointed teacher. James glanced at his truck. It was parked exactly within the lines of his own driveway. His jaw tightened. "Karen, this is harassment." Karen gasped, placing a hand on her chest in mock offense. "Harassment? Mr. James, I'm simply enforcing the rules that keep our neighborhood beautiful." James exhaled sharply, keeping his voice even. "Then tell me why I'm the only one getting these fines. I've seen plenty of houses breaking these so-called rules, yet somehow I'm the only one being enforced." Karen's smile flickered just for a second. She knew he was on to her. But instead of backing down, she leaned in. "I suggest you start respecting the HOA's authority," she said, her voice dropping lower. "Otherwise, things might get more difficult for you." James's eyes narrowed. "Was that a threat?" Karen's fake smile returned. "Oh, not at all. Just friendly advice." James stepped closer, towering over her, his voice steady. "Listen to me carefully. I don't scare easy. And I sure as hell don't back down from bullies." For the first time, Karen looked nervous, but she quickly composed herself, straightened her posture, and smirked. "Well then," she said, tucking her clipboard under her arm. "I guess we'll see who backs down first." She turned on her heel and walked away. James stood there, heart pounding, not from fear, but from anger. He had faced criminals, cartels, and some of the worst scum imaginable. And yet, something about Karen and her little power trip sent a different kind of chill down his spine. Because this wasn't over. She wasn't just going to stop. She was just getting started. James Rourke had dealt with criminals, con artists, and liars before, but he never expected to face that same level of manipulation and deception in his own neighborhood. It started subtly. Neighbors who once offered polite nods now avoided eye contact when he walked by. Conversations would die the second he stepped outside. At first he thought he was imagining it. Maybe people were just keeping to themselves. Then came the fake violation notices. Every morning, a new one. Trash bins left out too long. Except they were already inside. Grass too high. He had mowed it the day before. Improper vehicle storage. Even though his truck was parked in his own driveway, James knew what was happening. Karen was trying to paint him as a problem, turning the neighborhood against him one fine at a time. One evening, he caught his next-door neighbor, Mrs. Hendricks, an older woman who used to chat with him every morning, staring at him through her blinds. When he waved, she quickly shut the curtain. Something was wrong. Later that week, as James was pulling into his driveway, he spotted a group of neighbors standing in a tight circle, whispering. The second they saw him, they scattered like roaches. He had seen this tactic before: isolate, demonize, and then strike. And strike she did. James had just settled onto his couch when there was a loud knock at the door. 3 hard bangs. He opened it to find 2 police officers standing on his porch. "Sir, we received a report about a disturbance at this address," one of them said, his hand resting on his belt. James frowned. Disturbance? What kind of disturbance? The officer glanced at his notes. "A neighbor reported that you've been making threats, that you've been harassing the HOA president." James exhaled sharply. "Of course. Let me guess," he said, arms crossed. "Karen Reynolds?" The officers exchanged glances. That was all the confirmation James needed. "Sir, we need to ask, have you had any altercations with her recently?" James clenched his jaw. "Not an altercation. She's been harassing me for weeks, fining me for things I haven't done, trying to turn my neighbors against me. Now she's wasting police resources." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, but the older one kept a hard stare. "Do you have any proof?" James narrowed his eyes. "You mean, do I have proof that I haven't done something?" He shook his head. "That's not how this works." The officer sighed. "Look, we don't want any trouble. Just stay away from her. If we get another call, we'll have to take further action." James's blood boiled. He wasn't just some guy Karen could intimidate. He was a US Marshal. And he wasn't about to roll over because some suburban dictator thought she could play God. Still, he kept his cool. "No problem, officers," he said smoothly. "But I'd suggest looking into Karen Reynolds a little more closely. Something tells me this isn't her first time pulling something like this." The older officer studied him for a second, then nodded. As the police drove off, James stood on his porch, staring into the night. Karen had just escalated this fight, and she had no idea who she was up against. A few days had passed since the police showed up at James's door. He knew Karen wouldn't stop, but he didn't expect her next move to be this bold. It arrived in a crisp white envelope, HOA official business stamped in bold letters. James tore it open, scanning the neatly typed words. His stomach tightened. Formal notice of legal action. The letter accused him of being a danger to the community. It claimed he had been verbally aggressive toward HOA board members, intimidating neighbors, and creating an unsafe environment. It was absurd. A blatant lie. But it was worse than just another fine. This time, Karen had filed a formal legal complaint, stating that his threatening behavior warranted further action, up to and including possible eviction. James clenched, his jaw. He had seen this tactic before, when criminals tried to flip the script and make the good guy look like the villain. She was setting him up. And then, like clockwork, she made her next move. That evening, James walked outside to grab his mail. The air was thick with tension. Across the street, Karen stood with 2 other HOA members, her closest allies. They were waiting for him. The second he stepped onto his driveway, Karen let out a loud, exaggerated gasp. "There he is!" she shrieked, loud enough for the whole street to hear. James froze. What the hell was she doing? Karen turned to her allies, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable. I'm scared to even be near him. You saw how he looked at me the other day. He's unhinged. James exhaled slowly. Stay calm. Don't take the bait. One of the HOA members, a smug-looking man in a polo shirt, crossed his arms. You need to leave this neighborhood, James. People don't feel safe with you here. James kept his tone steady. You're lying, Karen, and you know it. Karen recoiled dramatically, taking a step back, as if he had just lunged at her, and then James saw it, a phone half hidden in her hand. She was recording. That was the plan all along. If he snapped, if he raised his voice, took a step forward, did anything she could spin as aggressive, she'd have it all on video. She was trying to frame him. James took a deep breath. Controlled, calculated. Then he did the one thing Karen didn't expect. He smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Then, in the calmest voice possible, he said, "Nice try." Karen blinked. What? James gestured to the phone. Recording this, huh? Hoping I'll lose my temper? He shook his head. You'll have to try harder than that. Karen's face twisted. The two men beside her exchanged nervous glances. James stepped back toward his house, eyes locked on hers. You should be careful, Karen. False reports, fake evidence, that kind of thing has consequences. And with that, he turned and walked inside, leaving Karen standing there, fists clenched, seething. She had set the trap, but James had seen it coming. And now? He was ready for war. It was a quiet evening. Too quiet. James Rourke was sipping his coffee, watching the sun dip behind the houses when he heard the sound. 3 hard knocks. He knew that knock, authoritative, meant to intimidate. James exhaled, set his mug down, and made his way to the front door. The second he opened it, he knew exactly what was happening. 2 police officers stood on his porch, hands resting near their belts. Their patrol car idled on the street, lights flashing, not full sirens, just enough to make a statement. Behind them, standing on the sidewalk with her best performance face on, was Karen Reynolds. She looked absolutely terrified. Fake tears, shaking hands, clutching her chest like she'd just seen a ghost. The taller officer, clearly the one in charge, squared his shoulders. Mr. James, we received a report that you made violent threats against Ms. Reynolds. James's jaw tightened. There it was, the final move in Karen's little game. He didn't react, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing even a flicker of emotion. Threats? He asked coolly. What exactly am I being accused of? The second officer, younger, read from his notepad. Ms. Reynolds claims you threatened to physically harm her. She says you've been intimidating her, stalking her movements, and creating an unsafe environment. James almost laughed. She was good, but he was better. Karen sniffled, her voice quivering just enough to sound believable. I was just doing my job as HOA president, she whimpered. He's been so aggressive, and when I tried to talk to him about his violations, he snapped. James tilted his head. She was really laying it on thick. The lead officer frowned. Sir, based on the report, we may need to bring you in for questioning. James took a slow, deep breath. He wasn't angry. He was focused. Because now, it was time to end this. James reached into his back pocket, slowly, deliberately, just like he'd done 100 times before. He pulled out his leather case, flicked it open, and held it up. The taller officer leaned in, then stiffened. His entire demeanor changed in an instant, because staring back at him from that badge was something that trumped any fabricated HOA complaint. James Rourke, US Marshal. A flicker of recognition crossed the officer's face. He looked up at James. Really, looked at him this time. And suddenly the narrative didn't make sense anymore. A highly trained federal law enforcement officer, snapping at a suburban HOA president, making wild, violent threats over petty fines? It didn't add up. The younger officer frowned. You're a US Marshal. James confirmed, voice steady. For over 10 years. Karen visibly paled. The lead officer cleared his throat. Mr. James, why didn't you mention this earlier? James finally allowed himself to smile. Because I wanted to see how far she'd take this lie. The officers exchanged glances. Karen took a desperate step forward. He's lying. That could be a fake badge. You need to arrest him. The younger cop turned toward her, suddenly less convinced. Ma'am, did you actually witness him making threats? Or was this just, something you assumed? Karen blinked. Whoa, what? The lead officer, now fully alert, crossed his arms. Ms. Reynolds, have you ever filed police reports against other residents in the past? Karen hesitated. I mean, I've had to report some unruly behavior before, yes, but James didn't let her finish. She has a history of harassing homeowners, he said calmly, issuing fake violations, fining people into submission, and now? Trying to have me arrested. The younger officer shifted on his feet. Mum, if what he's saying is true, filing a false police report is a serious offense. Karen stumbled over her words. This is ridiculous. He's dangerous. Look at him. Look at how aggressive he is. James smiled again. Calm, steady, unshaken. The officers weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. The lead officer exhaled. We are not making any arrests today. Karen's mouth fell open. But he's lying. The officer held up a hand. Ms. Reynolds, if we find that this complaint was knowingly false, you could face legal consequences. I suggest you be very careful with any future accusations. James said nothing. He didn't have to. Karen's entire face twisted in fury. She had played her final card, and it had blown up in her face. The officers gave James a small nod before heading back to their cruiser. As they pulled away, Karen stood frozen on the sidewalk, fists clenched, trembling, not from fear, but from rage. James stepped forward, voice low enough for only her to hear. Nice try. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. James leaned in just a little closer. This game you're playing? He tilted his head. You just lost. And with that, he turned and walked back into his house, leaving Karen standing. There, defeated, humiliated, and completely exposed. She had set the trap, and she had just walked into it herself. Karen Reynolds thought she was untouchable. She thought her web of lies would hold up, that the police would take her word over James's, that she could manipulate the system just like she always had. But this time, she picked the wrong target, because James wasn't just some random homeowner. He was a US Marshal, and unlike the neighbors she had bullied into silence, he knew how to fight back. And now? The walls were closing in on her. A few days after the police visit, James received a call. Mr. James, the officer's voice, came through the line. We have some interesting updates regarding your case. James smirked. I'm listening. The officer sighed. Let's just say, this isn't the first time Karen Reynolds has filed a complaint against a neighbor. James wasn't surprised. How many? A brief pause. 9 in the past 3 years. James's eyebrows raised. And, let me guess, all were dismissed? Every single one. The officer confirmed. But here's where it gets worse. Several of those reports included false evidence, edited security footage, forged violation notices, even fake witness statements. James's grip on his phone tightened. And no one ever pressed charges? She's gotten away with it because most of the people she targeted didn't want the legal hassle. But after your incident, we started digging a little deeper. And, well, people are finally starting to talk. James leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. Karen had spent years silencing people. Now, the silence was breaking. It started with a single email. Then 2. Then an entire flood. James had posted a simple message on the neighborhood forum. Has anyone else had issues with the HOA issuing unfair violations? Asking for reasons. Within hours, his inbox was full. One neighbor claimed Karen had fined her $500 for unauthorized holiday decorations, a single wreath on her door, Another said he was forced to pay for fence repairs that weren't even on his property. An elderly couple revealed they had almost lost their home because of the endless legal fees Karen kept piling on them. And those were just the minor stories. James reached out to a man named Mark Jeffries who had sold his house last year. The second they got on a call, Mark didn't hold back. "That woman?" Mark's voice was tight with anger. "She ruined me. I tried to fight her, but she kept hitting me with violation after violation. I spent thousands on legal fees before. I finally gave up and sold the house." James frowned. "Why didn't you take her to court?" Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Because Karen's husband is a lawyer." James's stomach dropped. "Wait, what?" Mark sighed. "Didn't you?" "No. Her husband, Richard Reynolds, is a defense attorney. He's the one who helps her build fake cases against people. That's why she's never lost. She's been fabricating evidence for years." James exhaled slowly. Now it all made sense. The fake police complaints, the edited security footage, the forged violation notices. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was running an entire operation, backed by her lawyer husband. James thanked Mark for his time and immediately made another call. Not to the police, not yet. This time he called a friend at the US Attorney's office. "Hey," James said when his friend picked up, "I need to run something by you. Ever heard of a lawyer named Richard Reynolds?" There was silence on the other end, then a slow whistle. "Oh yeah," his friend said. "And trust me, you're going to want to hear this." By the next morning, everything was set in motion. The police had reopened past complaints against Karen. Several neighbors were filing formal statements about the HOA's corruption. And James? He was preparing to hit Karen where it hurt the most because for the first time in years, Karen Reynolds was no longer in control. She had spent so long bullying, lying, and manipulating. But now, her lies were finally catching up to her. And the reckoning was about to begin. Karen Reynolds had spent years ruling Maplewood Estates like a tyrant. She controlled the HOA with an iron grip, silenced anyone who opposed her, and weaponized rules to punish those she didn't like. But now? Her reign was crumbling. James wasn't the only one who had enough of Karen's corruption and lies. Word had spread fast, too fast for Karen to contain. The truth about her fake police reports, unfair violations, and fabricated evidence had turned the entire neighborhood against her. And now? The HOA board had no choice but to take action. The emergency meeting was held in the community center, and this time, Karen wasn't in control. She sat at the head of the table, trying to keep her usual smug confidence. But there was something different about her now. She looked cornered. The room was packed. Residents who once feared her now stared her down, whispering, shaking their heads. They weren't scared anymore. The HOA vice president, Tom Bennett, cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable, like a man who had ignored a problem for too long and was finally forced to deal with it. "Karen," he began, flipping through a stack of documents, "we have received multiple complaints against you regarding abuse of power, falsified violations, and harassment of homeowners." Karen scoffed, crossing her arms. "Oh, please! This is ridiculous." "A few disgruntled homeowners. It's not just a few." Tom cut her off, his voice firmer than before. He turned to the audience. "If you've been unfairly fined or harassed by Karen Reynolds, please stand up." A moment of silence. Then, one by one, people stood. The elderly couple who nearly lost their home. The single mother who was fined for damaging HOA property when her son's basketball accidentally hit a street sign. The couple who had to pay thousands to fix their fence, only to find out Karen had pocketed the money. More and more people rose until half the room was on their feet. Karen's face paled. "James?" He stayed seated, arms crossed, watching her unravel. Tom adjusted his glasses. "Karen, based on overwhelming evidence, the board has voted on your immediate removal as HOA president." Karen's chair scraped loudly as she shot up. "This is a joke. I built this community. I made this neighborhood what it is," a voice from the back spoke up. "No, you just made it a nightmare." Laughter rippled through the crowd. But James? He wasn't laughing. He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Karen, did you really think you could get away with everything?" Karen's eyes snapped to him. Hatred flashed across her face. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You did this." James smirked. "No, you did this to yourself." As if things couldn't get worse, the door at the back of the room swung open, and in walked two police officers. Karen's smug facade shattered. The lead officer stepped forward. "Miss Reynolds, we need to speak with you regarding a false police report you filed against Mr. James." Karen froze. False? I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." The officer wasn't buying it. "We've reviewed security, footage, witness statements, and prior reports. It appears you have a history of fabricating complaints." Karen took a step back. "This is insane. You can't—" "Actually," the officer said, pulling out handcuffs. "We can." A gasp rippled through the crowd as Karen went pale. James stood up, looking her dead in the eye. "I warned you," he said quietly. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. The officers led her toward the exit, the room silent except for the clicking of handcuffs. As she was escorted out, she locked eyes with James one last time. And for the first time, she looked truly afraid. As the door closed behind her, Tom exhaled. He turned back to the board. "We'll be appointing a new HOA president soon," he said. "And I think we all agree. We need change." Applause erupted. James shook a few hands as neighbors came up to thank him. The fear that once loomed over the neighborhood, gone. As James stepped outside, he looked up at the sky. Finally at peace. Karen Reynolds thought she was untouchable, but in the end, she was just another bully who finally got what she deserved. For the first time in months, peace had returned to Maplewood Estates. The tension, the fear, the constant paranoia of receiving another bogus fine or a surprise visit from the police, it was all gone. Karen Reynolds was out. For good. James Rourke stood on his front porch, arms crossed, watching as neighbors mowed their lawns without fear of violations. Kids rode their bikes again, no longer worried that Karen would slap their parents with a fine for excessive noise. It was a different neighborhood now. And James had learned an important lesson. Karen thought she could control everyone through fear. She used the HOA like her own personal dictatorship, thinking no one would ever stand up to her. But people like her, they always fall. James had seen it time and time again. Whether it was in law enforcement or in everyday life, bullies always push too far. They don't know when to stop. And eventually they push the wrong person. For Karen? That person had been James. And when she tried to take him down, she never expected that he would be the one to take her down instead. 1 week after Karen's removal, the HOA held a special election to pick a new president. This time, the community wasn't going to let another dictator take charge. The winner, Lisa Martinez. She was one of the homeowners Karen had harassed for years. Unlike Karen, she actually listened to the community. The first thing she did? Eliminated the petty fines, refunded homeowners who had been unfairly charged, created a fair system where neighbors could actually vote on new rules instead of being forced to obey Karen's whims. And the best part? No more secret HOA police driving around looking for imaginary violations. For the first time in years, Maplewood Estates was a place where people actually wanted to live. But Karen's downfall was far from over. Her problems had just begun. Because, after her arrest, neighbors started taking legal action. Mark Jeffries, the man Karen forced to sell his home, filed a civil lawsuit for fraud. The elderly couple who nearly lost their home sued her for harassment. Even the HOA board turned against her, pressing charges for misappropriation of funds. And then, the real kicker. Her own husband left her. Once the investigation started, Richard Reynolds, the lawyer who had been helping her fabricate cases, quickly realized something. He was about to go down with her. So he did what lawyers do best. He flipped. Richard turned over documents, emails, even phone records that showed Karen had been running a full-blown HOA extortion scheme for years. With his help, prosecutors built an even stronger case against her. And in the end, Karen Reynolds wasn't just a disgraced HOA president, she was a convicted felon. As James stood on his porch watching the sunset, he thought about everything that had happened. He didn't plan on becoming the guy who took down the most corrupt HOA president in town, but sometimes fate puts you in the right place at the right time. James had spent years chasing criminals, bringing justice to people who needed it. And even though this was just a neighborhood problem, it followed the same rule he had lived by his whole career. Bullies only win when people stay silent. Karen had counted on fear to keep people in line. But fear only works until someone decides they've had enough. And James? He had enough. As he took a deep breath of the cool evening air, a smile crossed his face. No more fines. No more threats. No more Karen. Maplewood Estates was finally free. And with that, he had just one last thing to say. Never let bullies win. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.